this video, we're going to talk about a fallacy that's called the genetic fallacy. And what we're going to do are 8 things here. We're going to talk about what the genetic fallacy is. We'll look at the structure of the argument involved in the genetic fallacy. We'll talk about why it's a fallacy. We'll examine some common situations in which you can expect to run into it. Then we'll look at 3 examples of the fallacy. We'll talk about some of the things that you should be on the lookout for spotting it, for being on your guard. We'll talk, for those of you who are students, about how you can avoid mixing it up with other fallacies on, say, homework or tests or other kinds of evaluations. And then we'll finish by talking about how to be a better critical thinker in your own life and how you can avoid this fallacy yourself. So let's talk about the genetic fallacy. I want to get one thing out of the way right at the start because I've seen so many students fall into this. It's got nothing to do with DNA. It's got nothing to do with genetics in the current sense of the term. I know that it's got the word genetic in there, but it's being used in a different sense. It has to do with a focus on the genesis. It's a Greek word that means origin or source or beginning. Or literally coming into being of a claim or approach or idea or a practice, something like that. So the genetic fallacy has to do with origins. It does not have to do with code. It does not have to do with the DNA of somebody's ancestors or anything like that. It could have to do with race in a sense, and some very bad race-based thinking is examples of this genetic fallacy. We'll see why. Now, in a strict sense of the term, it consists in dismissing a claim, an approach, a practice, or an idea based on what is put forth or assumed to be the origin of it. There's something wrong with the origin, so we can dismiss it on that basis. And this is a fallacy that in some textbooks is not rigidly distinguished from an ad hominem fallacy. These kind of overlap, and we'll talk about that at the end. But for this video series and for a lot of textbooks, it is distinguished as something separate. Now, the structure of the fallacy. How is this set up? X is being claimed to be true or good or some other value like that. And the claim about X comes originally from origin or source A. We're going to say a hidden premise is source A is unreliable or bad. Another hidden premise is going to be the status of source A bears directly on any claims that come from source A. So you put all these together and you can get X is false or bad. This is not the only way to set up the structure of this fallacy. It could be that we're talking about a practice. We could say, this practice X is claimed as something that's good. But practice X comes originally from origin or source A, and we can do the whole hidden premises built in there, the whole cascade of argumentation. The whole idea here is that there's an assumption that's being made that somehow the status of the source, the status of the origin, has something to do with whether the practice, the idea, the proposal, the claim is any good here and now in the present when we're looking at it. If we look at it graphically, here's one way to represent it. Group A originates this claim that X is true or good or something, but there's some sort of defect on the part of Group A. There's something, that's not good about it. There's something that's off-putting or limited. And so we say that X, therefore, is false or bad. And this is, a sort of general schema. We have to do a little bit of work with this fallacy to get some of the examples to fit into there. But why is this a fallacy? One thing to keep in mind, both for this and for the genetic fallacy, is that a claim can be true or an idea or approach can be true or good independently of the status or the source or the status of the source or the origin for it. So good ideas can come from bad sources. One classic example that they use for this is, somebody has a brilliant scientific insight, but it occurs in a dream. Usually dreams are unreliable, but it turns out that you can independently corroborate the scientific insight, right? What's going on here is that there's a confusion between the truth or value of a claim, idea, practice, or approach, and the truthfulness or value of the origin or the source for it. Another confusion can occur between the truth or the value of, for example, a belief and the way or manner in which the belief was formed, like we just talked about. If you come across it in a dream, does that mean that the belief is no good? Does that mean the insight is no good? No, it means that you don't just dream it. You try to find if you can independently replicate it, right? If you can follow it out. In some cases, the person engaging in the fallacy may not even be correct about the origin of the claim. You see this all the time in political, in racial, in religious discussions where people just don't know their history at all, or they've got some, they've relied on somebody's bad history, very tendentious, polemical stuff, and they say, well, we all know that these people, or this group, and then they dismiss a lot of stuff that they shouldn't do on that basis. What are some common situations? So this fallacy was and still is particularly common among those who tend to engage in what's called the genetic method, using that mode of reasoning, classification, or inference. And what's the genetic method? It's thinking that when we trace things back to their origins, now we know the thing itself. It ignores the fact that things can change over time, they can progress, they can develop, they can become more and more comprehensive. If we're thinking about ideas, for example, the fact that an idea emerged in ancient Greece doesn't mean that it's an ancient Greek idea forever, like democracy, right? Democracy, we know more about democracy by looking at modern democracies than we do just by looking at, 4th and 5th century Athens. Right? Ideas and things change over time. There's a tendency to do this in terms of races, and oftentimes, it's relying on old-fashioned race science, which thankfully has been long since discredited among the actual scientific community. This happens with, all sorts of arguments about religious practices and texts and things like that. Like I put here, it occurs frequently in contexts like politics, policy making. An idea came from this, group originally, or for example, the Republicans always want to say, well, we're the party that came up with emancipation. We were about freeing the slaves. Yeah, but that's assuming that the Republican Party of 1865 bears a lot of resemblance to the Republican Party of 1892, let alone the party of 1994, let alone the party of 2015. Things change over time. Sources don't remain what they originally were. Same thing, we can say about all sorts of other things in politics. A good idea can come from a group that's involved in all sorts of bad things. Doesn't necessarily matter what the origin of an idea is. We need to think about the idea in its own terms. Religious and anti-religious polemics happens all the time. Religions quite often would take things from other sources and adapt them. Here's a great example. Christmas wasn't originally December 25th. What the Christians did is they took over a pagan holiday. Well, yeah, of course they did, because that was a day that everybody had off, and it was convenient. Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. Well, you know what? I mean, that's not really about that's not really that central to the idea of Christmas, whether we're talking about, what Christians originally had with it, or what the, capitalist marketplace has turned it into with candy canes and Santa everywhere and lights. We have to look at these things on their own bases. Education. A lot of bad ideas in education have come from great sources. A lot of great ideas in education have come from bad sources. Doesn't mean that the ideas correspond to the source, right? As a matter of fact, the process of education is in many cases a process of gradually acquiring better and better information, but also taking the bad information that you've got, figuring out what's wrong with it, and then developing better perspectives as a result. Purchasing and consumption. We do want to think about supply chains. The Apple iPhone, we probably should think in terms of who's actually making it, instead of just thinking about the Apple company and the sort of image that they put forth. But that's not to say that we can reduce the iPhone just to its supply chain, or reduce any sort of product to its basic components. Putting something together into a whole creates something new. That would actually be more of a case, now that I'm thinking about it, of the fallacy of composition, though. Race, gender, or class-focused reasoning. When we're rejecting ideas based on them coming from people who are from this race or that race, this ethnicity, this national origin, being male or female, or whatever else people want to say is out there, because there's a lot of haziness about exactly what gender is these days. Class, can't trust what rich people think about the economy, can't trust what poor people think about the economy. At a certain point, we have to evaluate ideas on their own merit without looking where the idea comes from. A big issue, too, is we could also put down, what magazine they came from, what website they came from. Did they come from a website that you tend to disagree with? It might still be a good idea. Here's some examples. This is a funny one. Getting hitched and buying rings. Now, modern engagement rings apparently are something fairly new. At least the women's, version with the big diamond and settings and all that. So here's something somebody might say. You know that the modern engagement ring was just a gimmick started by the diamond industry, don't you? It's got nothing to do with whether the two of you love each other or are compatible or should get married. And so you shouldn't purchase your fiancé an engagement ring. Now, it may be the case that, back in the 20s or 30s, diamond producer says, we gotta do something about this flat market and get people to buy these rings. Does that really mean that an engagement ring is not a symbol of love or commitment for us today? Are we back in 1930? This is an example of the genetic fallacy, because we found the origin of the idea. That's just what the idea is. That's just what the practice is. It's not what it is today. We've sort of peeled back the curtain. I think most people don't have any idea when they go to shop for an engagement ring that engagement rings, were started as this sort of practice. We could say the same thing about Valentine's Day, Sure, the greeting card industry had a real incentive in trying to get people to buy cards and buy chocolate and stuff like that. Does that mean that you're not expressing your desire or your love or appreciation or affection for somebody because you go and buy them a box of chocolates on Valentine's Day? No, that's the genetic fallacy right there. Let's look at another example. Never trust Monsanto. By the way, you probably shouldn't trust Monsanto on a lot of stuff, but there's independent sources out there that you can go and see, that can tell you why that would be a good idea to be wary of them, right? So here's a genetic fallacy. Why would you believe that study about the safety of GMO corn for even a second? You know that the researchers who carried out the study work and are funded by Monsanto, don't you? They've made an entire company out of creating and selling GMOs worldwide, so don't accept the study's findings. Now, there are some studies that are funded by Monsanto out there about the safety of GMO products that you might find a little questionable if you know something about study design and you pay attention to these sorts of things. But those are independent reasons for criticizing the studies. Simply saying, well, those people are getting paid by Monsanto, or the study came from that place, so we're not going to believe it, that's not a good idea. That's not a good reason to reject it. You need to find other reasons if you want to reject it. Or, just because it's coming from Monsanto doesn't mean that you should automatically accept it either. Chinese gooseberries. This is a very, very interesting case, isn't it? What are Chinese gooseberries? They're what we call kiwi fruits. They're actually a gooseberry. If you've ever eaten, little gooseberries and you look at them, you see that kiwi fruits bear a lot of resemblance to them. So why don't we call them Chinese gooseberries? Well, very simple. Nobody wanted to buy something that was labeled Chinese, in part because the Chinese were, communists. We're going to have to find some way to rebrand these fruits. They can't be Chinese gooseberries or nobody will want to buy them. After all, that would mean they come from Red China, our enemies. We don't want to be supporting our enemies, do we? We'll call them kiwi fruit because kiwis are cute and they come from Australia or New Zealand or somewhere down below. And this is an example of somebody doing something motivated by the genetic fallacy, motivated by the fact that other people are going to make their decisions based on the genetic fallacy. So, who are the other people? The consumers. They got ahead of it by saying, we're going to change the name of this because people are not going to buy something that says Chinese whatever. Sad but true. Not the case anymore since we buy so many products from China. How do you spot the genetic fallacy? Well, for one thing, pay attention to cases in which, instead of providing good grounds for rejecting something, reference is being made instead just to the origin or source of that thing, as if that solves the issue. So also, be on guard with people, groups, or organizations that tend to associate the reliability or the value of claims or practices or ideas with their original sources, overlooking what's happened to them in the process. Those kinds of people, those kinds of groups, those kinds of organizations are much more likely to fall into the genetic fallacy. What's not the genetic fallacy? Here's where it gets kind of messy. Like I said at the beginning, some textbooks, there's a little bit of controversy in the critical thinking community about this. What is the relationship between the genetic fallacy and the ad hominem fallacy? Some textbooks will actually blur them together. Some will say that ad hominem fallacies are actually a form of the genetic fallacy. Some will say that the genetic fallacy is actually a form of ad hominem. Some will maintain them as separate things. But then you got to be able to give some criteria for how they differ from each other. Here's my take. Here's what I like to do. I think that with ad hominem, you're focusing more on discrediting the source of the argument or the claim that's being made. With the genetic fallacy, you're just really tracing it back to the source and saying, well, look, here's where it originally came from. And then you're kind of letting the viewer or reader or thinker draw their own conclusions from it. You're not spelling the conclusions out like, that person's a dope, don't listen to them. Or, well, that they're an interested party. I think that's one way to distinguish these. Another thing to keep in mind, another one that we might mix this up with, in cases where a belief or practice is being dismissed or attacked because it's been around for a long time, perhaps by a group, what we've got there is actually an argument from novelty. If the whole force of the argument is, well, look, this idea has been around for a long time, old ideas are usually bad, new ideas are good, we've got an argument from novelty. You could have the argument looking a lot like a genetic fallacy, but actually falling into that. Now, not every argument that focuses on the source or origin of something is always necessarily a fallacious argument. There are ways to do it, but these are usually going to involve some spelling things out, explaining, well, where something came from way back when is relevant to what it is today. How do you avoid falling into this fallacy yourself? How do you become a good critical thinker? Well, try to avoid associating and judging the value or truth of ideas or practices just with their origin or sources. There's a lot of ideas that started out from bad sources, but they turned out to be good ideas. When a claim or idea or practice is suspect because of where it comes from, because you don't trust where it comes from, try to find reasons independent of the source for accepting or rejecting it. That's what a good critical thinker does. They look for reasons why they should accept or reject, reasons why to believe or to disbelieve something. Also, be open. This takes some work. Be open to the presence of truth or goodness, even among those who you tend to dismiss or distrust. Because quite often you're going to find, once you actually get to meet them, or if you're looking at historical sources, get to read them, experience them, that there's a lot more than you originally thought, and they may have more on the ball than you ascribed to them originally. Last thing I'm going to say, this video is part of a series discussing common fallacies in reasoning and argument, and it belongs to an entire channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, logic, and argumentation. So if you enjoy this video or you found this useful, share it with other people, and check out other videos and the series in this channel, because we're going to keep on adding more and more in the months and years to come.